So what we've got on this slide is how this fits in with the AQA A-level specification for the Cold War. So this is a third of the first year Cold War topic that is covered in this PowerPoint presentation. So obviously that's quite a lot of content. It's just an overview. It's not going into too much depth. And the idea of this is that as you're going through, you need to be thinking about trying to make links between the different topics. And I think it's really helpful if you think about the big questions that need to be answered and the sort of things that you might find essay questions are set about. So whilst we're going through, be thinking about what there is in terms of content that might help you to answer these questions. The big questions we need to think about: why was there a Cold War by 1949? Who was responsible for the Cold War? Was it Americans? Or was it the Soviet Union? Was it perhaps that you think the Cold War was in some ways inevitable after World War II? If we're looking at containment, so the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, what do you think the Americans' main motivations are there? Was this an altruistic act? Was it just there to help Western Europe, or were there some other ulterior motives that the Americans had? Likewise with the Soviet Union, we need to think about their establishing of satellite states in Eastern Europe. Was that just about security? Was it about spreading their ideology? What do we think the main motivations there were? And then finally, if we look at the division of Germany, who do we think was most to blame for that, or why did that happen? So the 4-year period that we're looking at here, let's have a think about the changes that happen. So in 1945, the Second World War is still going on. The Americans, the British, the Soviets and the French have been united in a grand alliance trying to defeat Nazi Germany. But the war comes to an end in Europe in 1945, and therefore these 4 countries are no longer united by a common enemy. By 1949, on the other hand, we have got a situation where the Cold War has become quite firmly institutionalised in Europe. So on the one hand, we've got the Western European countries involved in the European Recovery Programme, or the Marshall Plan as it's better known. We've got the East European satellite states, the ties being strengthened between them by Cominform. And we've got Germany split into 2 separate states by the end of 1949 into the Federal Republic of Germany, which is West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. And of course, also by 1949, we have got the establishment of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. That is a defensive treaty between Western European countries and significantly America, the USA. One of the arguments that we could put forward was the cause of the Cold War developing in this period was the fact that the Americans and the Soviets had conflicting ideologies. So remember, just in a simple way of looking at it, an ideology is it's a big idea that shapes the way that you would run a country. So it would shape the kind of political system, the kind of economic system that you would have. And at the end of World War II, you had some of the big powers, the big traditional powers in Europe, really being weakened by the amount of money they'd had to spend on the war. So, for example, Britain and France had large empires. These were starting to fall apart at the end of World War II because they couldn't afford the upkeep on those empires any longer. So, quite clearly, the 2 major world powers at the end of World War II were the USA and the Soviet Union. They had these very different ideologies. The Americans had free market capitalism, and that was what was driving them. So they wanted to be able to trade freely with other countries. So it was in their interest for as many countries as possible around the world to be free market capitalist countries, because then they would be willing to buy and sell. They would buy American goods, and the Americans would be able to sell them their goods. On the other hand, we've got the Soviet Union, which had a communist system since 1917, when the Russian Revolution happens. And the key thing here is that communists therefore didn't believe in a free market economy because they felt that that was something that exploited workers. So they didn't believe in the private ownership of industries. And if a lot of countries became communist and may not have wanted to trade freely with the Americans, that's obviously not in the interests of the USA. Whereas from the Soviets' point of view, the more countries that were communist, the easier it was for them to form allies. And the key thing here is that both the Americans and the Soviets wanted to try to spread their ideology as much as possible, and that was in their interest to do so, and gain as many allies as they could. So there were two major wartime conferences that took place in 1945, and we need to have a think about the fact that the cracks were already starting to show here because the war was coming to an end in Europe, and the realisation that Germany would soon be defeated meant that the country started to look more towards what was going to happen in the future, and obviously were less focused on just this drive to defeat Nazi Germany. So we'll have a look at Yalta first, and then we'll have a look at Potsdam and compare the same headings. So the context of Yalta in February 1945 was that Germany was on the brink of defeat. It hadn't actually quite been defeated yet. So in terms of Germany, obviously this is going to be a key concern of the Allies. What are they going to do about Germany once they have been defeated? So it was decided at Yalta to divide Germany into 4 zones, and each of the big 4 would take one of those zones and would be responsible for running that zone. It was decided to set up an Allied Control Council, so that was to oversee the running of these zones. Reparations were agreed on, so $20 billion of reparations were going to be paid by Germany, and of that, 50% of this was going to go to the Soviet Union because they had been affected the worst by the war. So 25 million Soviets were killed, huge damage to their infrastructure, to factories, to transport systems and so on. There were new borders decided between Poland and the Soviets, so effectively the Soviets took some territory from Poland and then Poland took some territory from Germany. Another really significant thing that happened at Yalta was the agreement on the Declaration of Free Europe. So that was an agreement that free and fair elections would be held in the Eastern European countries which were occupied by the Red Army. So when the Soviet Union drove the Germans out of the Soviet Union and back across Eastern Europe, they liberated the countries of Eastern Europe, but also significantly their army was occupying those countries. So the other allies were very keen to make sure that those countries had some kind of say in what their future would be. It wasn't going to just be dictated to them by the Soviet Union. And that's a point of contention going forward, as I'm sure you remember. On the subject of Japan, we have Stalin finally agreeing that he will help with the war in Japan. Up until now, we'd been very focused on trying to fight the Germans and push them back out of the Soviet Union. And finally, we've got an agreement there that the United Nations is going to be formed and the Soviets will join that. So on to Potsdam. And the big change between Yalta and Potsdam is, of course, that we've got different leaders, but particularly in the USA. So Roosevelt had passed away in between the 2 conferences, and he was replaced by the Vice President, Harry S. Truman, who had a very different outlook on the Soviet Union than Roosevelt had. So Truman was much more aggressive, and he was much more openly anti-communist. But of course, partly that's because Roosevelt had to try to work with Stalin for this common purpose of defeating the Nazis. That's less of a concern at Truman's by this point. So this takes place in June, and the Germans had unconditionally surrendered the previous month. What had also happened just before the Potsdam Conference was that the Americans had successfully tested their first atomic weapon, and that was partly a way, as we'll come on to later, to try to intimidate the Soviet Union. So Germany is still a key issue here, and it was agreed that the Allies would work towards denazifying, demilitarising and democratising Germany. But they would do that in their own zones. It was very difficult for the Allies to decide a way forwards for Germany and what's going to happen in the long term. So they just focused on doing those jobs in their own zone. But they agreed that the economy of Germany would be run as a whole, so they wouldn't have too much independence on how they were going to run the economy in their own zones. On the subject of Poland, Truman wasn't happy with the way that the Soviets had set up a government in Poland which was very pro-communist. So they'd set up what was known as the Lublin government in 1944. The Allies, on the other hand, the other Allies, preferred the government that had been exiled in London. The Polish government had been exiled in London, and they were hoping that they would take power in Poland. So as a way of trying to calm that issue down, Stalin agreed that there would be more non-communists in the Polish government. And in terms of the rest of Eastern Europe, it was pretty well understood that the Soviet Union had quite a different understanding than the Americans, French and British about what free and fair elections meant. But realistically, Truman, as Roosevelt before him had done, realised there wasn't really a lot that they could do about that. The only way of stopping the Soviets from sort of their gradual attempts to impose communist governments in Eastern Europe would be to actually threaten them with ground troops. And of course, there was no appetite for doing that so soon after World War II. In terms of Japan, the Americans dropped atomic bombs on, first of all, Hiroshima and then Nagasaki just after the Potsdam Conference. And that forced Japan to surrender. It also is believed to have been perhaps motivated by an attempt to kind of show the Soviets how powerful the Americans were and try to get Stalin to back down on certain issues and to do what the Americans hoped that they would do with regard to, for example, the new governments in Eastern Europe. But instead, probably what it made Stalin do was dig even deeper into Eastern Europe, believing that that was the way forward for securing the Soviet Union.